the tree. A says, Look, what can you see? A bear in boots as big as can be. B says, Look, what can you see? A cat juggling cupcake with glee. C says, Look, what can you see? A dog dancing silly as can be. D says, Duh. Look, what can you see? An elephant eating eggs for tea. E says, Look, what can you see? A frog flying kites up in a tree. A says, Look, what can you see? A goat with glasses smart as can be. G says, Ga. Look, what can you see? A hippo wearing hats by the sea. H says, Ha. Look, what can you see? An iguana skating happily. I says, Look, what can you see? A jellyfish jumping joyfully. J says, Ja. Look, what can you see? A kangaroo knitting by the sea. K says, Ka. Look, what can you see? A lion licking sweets with glee. L says, La. Look, what can you see? A monkey drinking cup of tea. M says, Muh. Look, what can you see? A newt napping on a big green tree. M says, Nah. Look, what can you see? An octopus opening jars with glee. O says, Oh. Look, what can you see? A pig painting trees so happily. P says, Pup. Look, what can you see? A quail wearing a queen's crown. Wee! U says, Quack. Look, what can you see? A rabbit reading happily. R says, Rah. Look, can you see? A snake singing songs for you and me. I says, Look, what can you see? A turtle tap dancing happily. C says, Top. Look, what can you see? An umbrella eating ice cream with glee. U says, Look, what can you see? A vulture vacuuming by the tree. V says, Va. Look, what can you see? A whale wearing a woolly tee. W says, Wah. Look, what can you see? An X-ray eating cookies for T. X says, Kicks.